difficulties, we will put the recording of this on the Clean Water Initiative YouTube site. So we're sharing the link to that. Feel free, this is a small enough group, feel free to put questions in the chat as they come to you. There'll be moments throughout where we'll take a pause, and there's also a Q&A session at the end. I think I know everyone on this call right now, but I'm Gianna Petito. I'm the grant supervisor for the Clean Water Initiative Program. Been so for about 2 years. And prior to this, I was the district manager for the Winooski Natural Resources Conservation District. So organizational capacity is certainly an issue that is near and dear to my heart. I am really honored to be the technical project manager for the Capacity Development Initiative. In this role, I oversee securing some funds for it through budgeting processes and also designing the structure of the initiative. And just want to express my thanks to a lot of the team members who have provided assistance to date in the design of this, and to both Rachel Wood and Rachel McKimmey, my colleagues, for helping me facilitate today's webinar. So this is our agenda for today, and we're sharing in the chat a link to the Clean Water Workforce Capacity Development Initiative summary document. It might be helpful to have open. The state of Vermont has had some challenges with their website. I think it's accessible right now to get this document, but you may have to access it a little bit later. We're going to attempt to cover a little bit of everything. So some background on the initiative, some previous work we've done to date, basic and key information on the currently open requests for proposals, and then a deep dive into information for future potential sub-grantees or sub-applicants. So this is our agenda, and again, we'll have a Q&A at the end, hopefully some time in between as well to address any questions. So to start off with, who is CWIP? We are CWIP. We are the Clean Water Initiative Program. This is our newly minted vision and mission. We are located in the Water Investment Division in the Department of Environmental Conservation in the Agency of Natural Resources. And we really aim to efficiently, effectively, and equitably align clean water efforts statewide, develop the resources to support clean water projects, and then capture and communicate the impact of these efforts. The Clean Water Initiative is a multi-agency initiative that does exist in statute. So there's a link to the statute we're providing in the chat. But one of the purposes of the initiative broadly is to provide the financing necessary to achieve and maintain compliance with Vermont's water quality standards. So we achieve the intent or purpose of this by managing a suite of grant programs for what we call clean water projects. And what do we mean by clean water projects? There's some images or examples of this here. It can run the gambit of different sectors, types of work, but really it's anything installed on the landscape that has a benefit for water quality. So you're looking here at some projects on the left that are capturing stormwater runoff from roads or parking lots. Top right is a dam removal, and the bottom right is a project that lowered a floodplain bench so the river could have access to more of its floodplain. So there's a lot of different types of projects that are captured in this framing of what is a clean water project. So next, to provide a little bit of context into the initiative, why we're doing this, why have a Clean Water Workforce Capacity Development Initiative. There's a lot of money that's been coming into the state. This shows sort of the precipitous rise of just the clean water budget, both with American Rescue Plan Act dollars, that's the red dashed lines of the last few fiscal years, as well as sort of a rise of the state revenues that were going into the Clean Water Fund to support the clean water budget. You may have been hearing in the news other sort of short-term federal funding going into the state, $63 million in bipartisan infrastructure law funding for water infrastructure, $100 million in American Rescue Plan Act money outside of the clean water budget, also going to water infrastructure. So there's really a lot of money and interest and demand for clean water projects to be happening in Vermont, and our partners are really getting pulled in a lot of directions. At the same time, this is really a pulse of funding, and we recognize there may be a bit of a fiscal cliff that we're all facing. And so we really want to make sure that the state and our partners can meet this upsized demand for clean water projects in a way that's effective, but also sustainable to avoid a bit of a boom and a bust experience for all of us. So what is the Clean Water Workforce Capacity Development Initiative, or affectionately called CWWCDI? This is our current initiative purpose. It highlights who we're hoping to support, how, and to what end. So we want to support in the capacity of our partners, entities who are both our current partners or potential future partners, in a way that's equitable and inclusive, really focusing on unmet capacity needs, to result in a strong partnership network that continues to efficiently deliver high quality and high priority clean water projects. What do we mean by the clean water workforce? CWIP works with a lot of partners all across the state, in a lot of different roles. So these partners have different expertises and roles in the life of a clean water project too. So we have, the landowners or the municipalities. We have folks overseeing the projects, these project managers. We have funding partners at the federal and state level. We have technical engineer consultants. So there's really a lot of folks that are necessary to come together to make a project successful. And some of these folks also work in different sectors. So we have partners in the ag sector, or natural resource sector, or stormwater sector. And so it's really a big workforce that Vermont is fortunate to have access to. So when it came for us to try and create a definition for what is the clean water workforce, we decided to go pretty broad and use the life cycle of a clean water project to point to that as who's involved in the workforce. So thinking about this arrow being the life cycle of a clean water project, to first being an assessment on the landscape that identifies a potential project, to it being developed, designed, implemented, and maintained. Anyone who is involved in that process or would like to be involved in that process, we would consider part of the clean water workforce. Our definition of that doesn't necessarily equal who might be eligible for grant funding, but it's sort of broadly who we're talking about when we're talking about this initiative and our goals. So that's the context. Now we're going to review a little bit of what we've done to date. We did a phase 1 of this initiative, so we want to talk about what we did for that, what we learned, and now how that's informing the current structure of the Clean Water Workforce Capacity Development Initiative. So we did a lot of pre-assessment work back in 2021. And so in the very early phases of this initiative, we did an internal review of our funding programs as they relate to clean water project work. And we wanted to see, with the change of, with Act 76 of 2019, we did quite an overhaul of how our funding programs were going to get delivered on the ground. And we wanted to see where there might be gaps in capacity that are presented by that change. We reviewed a lot of written materials about capacity development that have been developed for grant-making institutions, and we developed our own diagram of what we consider capacity. What is organizational capacity? What are the factors that make up that organizational capacity? Sort of our own definition for that. We made informational interviews with staff from both the Lake Champlain Basin Program and the Water Quality Division at the Agency of Ag. Both those folks hold similar capacity development initiatives, so we wanted to get lessons learned from them and review their materials, their granting materials. And then we convened a focus group, which had a small collection of some of our regular clean water partners to get some more input, broadly discuss this initiative, and help us really refine some of our goals and the purpose of the initiative. So after all that work, we had a better sense of what it means to invest in capacity, but we didn't really know what the capacity gaps were on the ground and what our clean water workforce really needed. So that led us to, in 2022, putting out a request for proposals and contracting with the Clark Group. And they did a bunch of informational interviews with diverse partners, both current and kind of potential, about what their needs were. And the Clark Group generated a final report, which kind of highlights all of these capacity gaps and recommended interventions. And we did a public presentation for this in October. And then we posted this and solicited more public feedback through the end of December on reactions to the final report from partners to say, did we capture it all? Are we missing any capacity gaps? Are we missing any recommended interventions? So this is some of the findings, some of the main takeaways, at least from our perspective, the Clean Water Initiative program's perspective. And we've been spending the last few months digesting a lot of the report and digesting a lot of the partner feedback. I still recommend, if you haven't, read the report. It has a lot of great content in there. And there was a lot of time spent both by the partners in participating in interviews, giving us feedback in the survey, and the Clark group in generating that report. But some of the key findings really are that there are some DEC internal operations and policies that can create some administrative burdens for our partners that take away from their capacity to do clean water work. There are wide-ranging training needs as well as capacity needs of our partners, lots of requests for different things to be trained in. Organizations are really diverse, and flexibility is paramount to a successful capacity building effort. And I think maybe one of the biggest takeaways from the report is that we've traditionally been funding clean water projects on a project-based by project-based grant, and that style of funding is really ill-equipped in supporting organizational health. And that's kind of led to these critical capacity gaps in our clean water workforce. The critical capacity gaps are really complex in the report, and some of them are quite interrelated. So we spent some time digesting a lot of that and defining for our program 3 priority goals for our capacity support moving forward. So with all of that in mind, this is the current structure of the Clean Water Workforce Capacity Development Initiative. Hearing that there was administrative burdens associated with our policies and processes, we'd like to make some process improvements. Our program has just been wrapping up our internal strategic plan. One of the key pillars or strategies that came out of this was process improvements. So we are proceeding with that. And hopefully that will have some benefits down the line as those come to fruition. Another thing we're exploring is, given that there were a multitude of requests for different training content, we're exploring our role to serve as a program as a clearinghouse for clean water related training content, and or as a content developer where gaps exist or as requested by subgrantees. This component of the initiative is still under development, where it's really an exploratory phase, and we may not be the right entity ultimately to serve in this role. But we wanted to recognize that there was a ton of that coming out of the report, and so we wanted to leave space for exploring that. We are implementing the very first recommendation out of the Phase 1 report, which is to establish a multi-year capacity building grant program via the CWWCDI Clean Water Workforce Capacity Development Initiative block grant. And a lot of this presentation today will be a deeper dive specifically into this direct grants arm of the initiative. We're also exploring integration of adaptive management principles where feasible into our structure. So we've included some reporting questions, both to the block grant holder, the funding program administrator, as well as subgrantees that will provide us feedback, not just on the grant, but also on maybe training needs or other process improvements. So we're trying to figure out ways to continue to do a bi-directional communication system with our partners. And then finally, we're really hoping that the way we structure this will allow us to tell a better story about the value of this investment. And we're looking to our partners to help us with that storytelling as well. So we're going to take a deeper dive in a lot of this presentation today, specifically about the direct grants. But I wanted to start off with highlighting, based out of Phase 1 work, the Phase 1 report, the Phase 1 findings, these are our 3 priority goals in terms of how will we direct this money to meet those capacity gaps. So our goals in this grant program are to catalyze community engagement, relationship building, and enhance representation, to transition administrative, financial, and fundraising roles and processes towards sustainable and streamlined solutions, and to support professional development and a workforce pipeline for careers in clean water project management. So I'll stop there and see, is there any questions sort of just in the overview pieces about who we are, why we're doing this initiative, or some of the takeaways from Phase 1? Great. Okay. So now I'm diving into the block grant pilot overview. We have a proposal out, a request for proposals out now, and it is for a Clean Water Workforce Capacity Development Initiative block grant. So just briefly, what is a block grant? The Clean Water Initiative Program initially oversaw a bunch of individual projects. You may be familiar with the Ecosystem Restoration Program grants. That's denoted by line A in this diagram, in which we sort of would do our individual call for proposals, review a suite of different clean water project proposals, select the ones that had the best potential benefit for water quality, and then oversee each project implementer's deliverables and milestones. As their funding has scaled up, we've really shifted more to this block grant design, which relies on a funding program administrator. So that's explained in line B, or denoted in line B in this diagram, where selected funding program administrators independently put out their call for proposals, select the right organizations based on our guidance, and then oversee the proposals or projects as they proceed so that they follow our milestones and result in the deliverables as needed. We provide guidance to the funding program administrators, either through the grant agreement documents or through our funding policy. So we're sharing the link to our funding policy. We do have a standard suite of duties we usually expect of funding program administrators. It's on page 20 of our funding policy. Given the nature of this specific initiative to provide enhanced capacity support to a bunch of partners, and the fact that it's designed as a pilot and we need some feedback, this particular one, it has some additional duties we're writing in and requesting of a funding program administrator. Because of that, we're accepting a slightly higher cap on the program delivery portion of the budget. So program delivery supports the funding program administrator's time doing this work. Usually we cap that at 15%. We'll accept up to 20% in proposals under this open request for proposals. So these are some examples of things that are unique for the funding program administrator under this block grant design. And the first is sort of enhanced collaboration with DEC. We usually always collaborate with our funding program administrators, but in this area, we're sort of expecting some additional assistance in finalizing some of the materials. We have, for example, a draft application Excel and reporting Excel, but we'd like to work with the funding program administrator to adjust the platform, adjust the format so that it's more accessible or administratively simpler to for folks to be able to use these materials. We'd like the funding program administrator to reach new audiences that they may not have reached if they've had prior experience in funding program administration work. We would like the funding program administrator to provide hands-on support to applicants in filling out the application materials, any grantees in filling out any reporting materials. We have the option for the funding program administrator to provide shared capacity services. For example, if several organizations haven't done a recent audit and need to hire some auditing services, maybe it makes the most sense for that to be available through the funding program administrator and hired out as needed to different organizations. We're asking for kind of minimal level of data synthesis. We're doing some quantification of reporting and are requesting the funding program administrator's assistance in sort of aggregating that data and doing some summary stuff. No statistics needed, no statistics background needed. And we are asking for feedback. And so we're kind of integrating a funding program administrator report that is new and different from prior block grants. So the request for proposals for this block grant is open now. The link, thank you so much, to the RFP is posted in the chat. Questions are due July 12th at 4 p.m. Please focus your questions on this request for proposals, which is specific for a funding program administrator, not for individual capacity development opportunities. That will come once the funding program administrator is selected, and proposals are due July 28th. The size of the grant right now is $400,000 with potential to change, more to be added. We settled on a lower starting number given that it is a pilot design and the unusual amount of flexibility baked into this grant to start off with. It is a mix of state and federal dollars as well. So I thought this image would give a nice mental pause for folks. That was a lot of information. Next, we're going to go into a deep dive into this block grant design. review some of the information that may be more relevant and useful for potential subgrantees. Really want to focus on that because the open request for proposal right now really does not provide a ton of information on that, although the initiative summary document does. But before we do that, are there any questions on the block grant request for proposals that I can help answer? Great. Okay, quiet group. So moving on to information for potential subgrantees. Who can apply? We've left this as broad as we can in an effort to be to open access as much as we can. So the list of eligible entities is the same list that's found in our funding policy about who can be a grantee. These are folks who can apply as a subgrantee into this block grant pilot. All of these entities are eligible as long as they're also located in Vermont. We have no additional requirements related to the organization's history or experience in clean water or their mission statement. This is intentional to open the door for potentially new partners who want to gain some expertise in this area. And in terms of the application process, again, we do have a draft application, but we want to work with the funding program administrator to refine these materials for accessibility and simplicity. What can we propose? We're turning this question on its head. It's super exciting. So thank you to all potential subgrantees for being test subjects in this unusually flexible grant design. If any of you are used to the Clean Water Initiative program, you might be used to us saying things like, these are the very specific project types that are eligible. These are the very specific milestones that must be completed. And this grant initiative is unique in that we're not listing eligible activities. We're focusing much more on our desired outputs, outcomes, and impact for the program. So we do have some structure. We do have a list of ineligible expenses. These are sort of baseline things that state and federal funds cannot be used for. But other than that, we are leaving the door open on what activities are being proposed as long as they achieve certain things. So as long as they lead to capacity increase and clean water impact, as long as they address at least one of the priority goals for the direct grants program, and as long as they demonstrate that they can be sustainable in the absence of future funding. So we'll talk a bit more about it as we walk through each of these, but really we're relying on a review committee, which would be managed by the funding program administrator, to consider the convincing nature of proposals. So we recommend for subgrantees to get your best writers on it, and that the funding program administrator is also there to assist. So we're going to walk through each of these now. Ineligible expenses list. There are two lists. One is just totally ineligible stuff, regardless of funding source. And the other list is stuff that state funding could be used for, but federal funding cannot. This does add a layer of complexity in terms of financial tracking. It's more complex on the tracking side, but we wanted to leave the door open for more opportunities for activities, and that is why we made this decision. I'm not going to read through all of these. These are listed in the request for proposals and also in the grant summary document. So I recommend folks take a look at those, but this just gives a general sense that there are some things that just can't be proposed. There are some baseline things that can't be proposed. We're expecting the funding program administrator to make sure that their billing and invoicing can track this as well. But what can be proposed? So the first thing here is that, any activity goes, but it needs to lead to an increase in your capacity and have a clean water impact. And so what do we mean by that? How are we gonna get ourselves there? We're proposing a logic model design as part of the subgrantee application. The basics of a logic model is that you're sort of going from left to right. A left is what you're doing, your inputs, and then as you move from outputs, outcomes, and impact, it's sort of a time scale further away from when you first did your activity. It's a theory of change. It sort of demonstrates how a visual depiction of your underlying assumptions, how you think your first activity is going to lead to an immediate output, a medium-term outcome and impact. So it's a way for subgrantees to demonstrate how the things that they're proposing will lead to the outcomes that we're looking for as a program. So in this sort of logic model, the activity section is totally blank. Think Mad Libs, anything goes. But the outputs, outcomes, and impact are structured and are drop-down lists. So we would ask the subgrantee to pick at least one for each of these. And this is how we're going to be giving the flexibility to do the activity, but make sure that the intent of the program is still achieved by focusing on what's coming out of the program. So outputs are sort of the immediate short-term result. Outcomes is where we're measuring capacity. So this is where we integrated our program's definition of what makes up organizational capacity and all the different examples or factors that can feed into it. And then impact is where we're looking at the clean water impact of all of this work. Another component of the application is a narrative, inviting folks to explain the logic of the logic model. So they would fill out this logic model and then explain why, give us the reasoning why you think these activities will have this change in your capacity and why you think this change in capacity will lead to this impact. So a convincing narrative is really a key component of this grant. The activities do need to address at least one of the priority goals. That's an intent of this whole initiative, is to address capacity gaps, and we used phase 1 to figure out what those gaps were. So we really are putting a lot of weight into the findings of the report and the feedback from our partners, and want to make sure that that's integrated into this design. So again, these are the 3 goals of the funding program: to catalyze community engagement, relationship building, enhance representation, transition admin, financial, and fundraising roles and processes towards sustainable and streamlined solutions, and to support professional development and a workforce pipeline for careers in clean water project management. In the summary document, on page 18, there are 2 tables that I would really recommend potential subgrantees familiarize themselves with. It provides a lot more detail into each of these 3 goals, a description of the challenge or the gap, why this matters for capacity and clean water work, what our objectives are in supporting it, and then a whole suite of example activities that could be interpreted to be supporting that priority goal. So a lot of this text came from the report, came from the survey feedback we got from partners, and it's a lot of text there to really show the flexibility of these goals and how there might be a whole suite of seemingly very different activities that can really support these goals. It might be useful in writing application content. And then the last piece is that the activities need to be sustainable in the absence of future funding. It may not have to be the activity, it could be the outcome or impact, but it needs to be convincing that what you're investing in can continue if and when this funding is no longer available. So this is a snapshot of the current application template. And again, it's maybe not super user-friendly. Not everyone is very comfortable with using Excel, and we would like to work with the funding program administrator on figuring out the best accessible platform for folks. But what I'm showing here to highlight, this is a PDF attachment to the open request for proposal right now. And what I'm showing here is to highlight what I mean when I'm pointing at these different pieces. The very bottom is a snapshot of the logic model, where all the way on the left, it's blank. And then you have options to pick what your output would be and how many numbers of the output, what capacity you think would be affected by that, and what impact you think your activity will lead to. And then the top are these narrative questions that we would invite folks to sort of explain the logic model, which priority goals the activity hits, how those activities are supposed to reasonably impact your capacity, and how that capacity is supposed to reasonably lead to an impact, and then how these things are going to be sustained through time. What's likely to get funded? It's kind of an unknown. This is new. This is a new grant program, and it's an unknown volume of need or applications. The current dollar amount put into this request for proposals is just slightly higher than the total request that was sent into the Lake Champlain Basin Program's last round of capacity, and they receive applications from both New York and Vermont. So we're not really sure if there's going to be a need to prioritize, but we do have prioritization guidance provided to the funding program administrator in the summary document. It's worth looking over. And so these are some of the emphasis. These are some of the things we'd like emphasized, though. Directing funding towards areas of state or the organizations that don't otherwise have access to, or work that aligns well with the goals of other major capacity grants. Specifically, we're talking about the Lake Champlain Basin Program capacity funding and the Agency of Agriculture's Water Quality Division capacity program. We'd like funding directed towards new or non-traditional clean water partners where feasible. We'd also like it prioritized towards the strongest proposals. And here we think the strongest proposals would be those with a well-researched and justified budget. While applicants can just select one output, one outcome, and one impact, those that propose a range of capacity improvements and impacts might be stronger. And then those proposals that have very compelling narratives. So I will stop there. Hopefully this is a beautiful picture for a mental pause break. We're going to move forward into what we're envisioning for reporting and storytelling. So I'll take a pause here to see if there's any questions on what's envisioned for sort of the application process or the types of things that can get funded under this block grant. Okay, great. And feel free to throw your questions in the chat as you're digesting this and as they come to you. So talking now about measuring success, I'm going to sort of be at the same time talking both about how we think subgrantees would be reporting back to the funding program administrator and to DEC, but also how that is going to get integrated into how we at DEC report in the Clean Water Investment Performance Report back to the legislature and back to the public. So the Clean Water Initiative Performance Report summarizes the state of Vermont's clean water efforts and demonstrates how these investments are making a difference in water quality. This is spearheaded by our team member, Claire Madden. And we've been having conversations with Claire about some future improvements as we get launched onto our new state fiscal year 2023 report, specifically around how do we capture sort of the value of these indirect investments? A lot of our system is structured around projects and project-based funding and project-based outputs, but increasingly as some of our partners and we are making indirect investments in capacity and otherwise, how do we demonstrate that those investments and the outcome of those investments in this report? So we're envisioning potentially a new section of the report that captures some of this. And that sort of informs the reporting that we've envisioned for this grant program. And it impacts what we would ask the subgrantees and the funding program administrator to tell us. So we're thinking there are some ways we might be able to quantify outcomes, and in other cases, we'd have to use more of a, it'd be hard to put a number on it. So we would like to do more of a qualify the outcome or the impact. So in terms of quantifying it, we're looking at the outputs that we're requesting people to report back on. We're thinking of a way to quantify the change in capacity or the outcomes, and I'll walk you through just briefly what we're envisioning there. And then we'd like to use impact, the sort of longer term clean water impact as an opportunity to tell a story of this investment. So I'll walk through each of these now. But I think the big piece to really emphasize and the big takeaway here is that, well, two pieces. One, we've really tried to focus on reporting metrics that are simple to access, really relevant for this report and for the public and the legislature, and that we are really relying on the funding program administrator and subgrantees to be active and thorough in their reporting. So it'll help us shape the story of the value of capacity funding. So to start off with, the outputs and performance measures. This is in table 3 on page 13 of the summary document. Again, this is what folks would select, one or more of these that will be an output for their proposal. This table also provides in the second column sort of an interpretation of it, or different ways a suite of different work could probably lead to that output. So hopefully that might also be helpful in the application phase. But whatever they pick, one or more, we're going to ask them to then report on how many of those, how many beans they can count at the end as well. So this is what we're going to call a performance measure for this grant agreement. They're all designed and selected to be hopefully very easily countable. We're also hoping it covers the full suite of possible activities that folks may propose, but we're open to receiving feedback on how this might be changed over time if it's not all encompassing. The next one is outcomes, or where we're kind of documenting the actual change in capacity of these organizations. So as a reminder, we as an organization created our own sort of definition of what we would call organizational capacity and all the different categories and factors like technical or financial or network capacity, and then all the sort of examples of things that could lead to that. Subgrantees can select just one and say, everything I'm doing is going to get me this much better, this much greater, or they can select more than one. But whatever they select, we'd ask them to report on as well. And we're asking for a pre and post assessment for each of those factors that they pick. And all they have to do is pick one number before they do their capacity work and after they do their capacity work for how true the statement is for their organization. So for example, if there's a financial capacity one that says our financial operations are responsibly managed and reflect sound accounting principles, etc., how true is it before you do your work, your capacity work, do your capacity work, and then do a post assessment and pick on a scale of 1 to 5. So we're hoping that's not terribly onerous for people to report on. And we're doing some talking in-house about how we might demonstrate this change graphically and in the performance report over time. This is where we might ask for the funding program administrator to do some number aggregating for us, but it would be minimal. Oops, sorry. And then the last piece is impact or storytelling. These are draft instructions that we've envisioning for the subgrantees to provide a narrative reflection long-term on whether their capacity efforts have resulted in the impacts that they proposed. This can be a couple sentences up to a paragraph. We're hoping it's not terribly onerous. But as you can see, this stuff is really hard to quantify. And so we're kind of going the route of seeing what narrative comes out of this and seeing what we can learn and what story we can tell. Again, we're envisioning this happening right after capacity investments are complete by the subgrantee, and then potentially up to a year later to do a retrospective report on if anything has changed. So there's a diagram of this in the summary document, just visualizing all the sort of touch points with the subgrantee and when information might be collected from them. So there's the application piece where we'd ask them to describe their activities, their budget, their outputs, outcomes, impact, and then narrative descriptions, as we talked about. If they get selected for funding, they would complete a capacity pre-assessment. Again, that's just picking a number 1 through 5 based on whichever ones they think will change. When they're done their capacity work, they would do a final report. They would report on the number for their outputs. They would do a capacity post-assessment, and then they would do their narrative report on impact, any feedback they have for us on the program, and an outreach end form if that is applicable. And then about a year later, they would do a follow-up retrospective report, narrative on impact. Same short question, a couple sentences to a paragraph. I'll pause there. We're going to go into some adaptive management plans and do some wrap up from here and talk a little bit about some grant design principles. But before I dive into that, any questions on what we're envisioning for reporting, both from the subgrantee, but also how it affects our report back to the legislature and the public? Okay, great. So moving on to, this is adaptive management, but also some principles for design. Just dove into a ton of details. Hopefully that's useful context for folks, both for people who might be interested in applying to be the funding program administrator, also for organizations who might want to be a potential sub-grantee just to get to thinking about what might be eligible. I hope that's useful information, but I want to take a step back and ask, what were some of the reasons behind this decision making? Why is the grant structured this way? We have some principles for the design of this grant program. They're kind of self-imposed, but they came about for a few different reasons. So we wanted to build this funding opportunity in a way that built confidence in the design. The capacity funding is limited, and so we want to make sure it's distributed in a way that's equitable, inclusive, responsive. We also want to make sure these public investments are made soundly and in a manner that can demonstrate impact that's in alignment with the intent of the Clean Water Fund, which is a large portion of the dollars that are going into this block grant agreement. So we have a table in the summary document that takes each of these terms and just says where that impacted how we designed the grant. I don't need to deep dive into those today. Happy to take questions on them if there are any, but we put that there just to give us a bit more context into some of the reasoning behind it, particularly our effort to be responsive to what we were hearing from phase one in making this as flexible as possible. We thought that was really important to make sure that that came to fruition, hopefully. And then in terms of adaptive management, I alluded to this earlier, but we've done a few things throughout to try and help us address potential changes to this initiative over time. Again, this direct grants block grant is a pilot. It is subject to change. The eligibility of activities may change. It might become less flexible over time as we learn and see what comes in the door. But we are asking for feedback in the reporting documents from subgrantees. We're also asking for the funding program administrator for a specific report from them. And we've started a suite of questions for the funding program administrator, but can work with them on what would be the best things to ask in terms of thinking about managing this entire initiative adaptively. And then finally, some main takeaways, next steps, and if there are any questions, some time for that. So the main takeaways that I hope you leave here today understanding is that Vermont needs a strong clean water workforce, that the Clean Water Workforce Capacity Development Initiative is potentially more than just the direct grants program, although that's an important piece that we've really fast-tracked and tried to get that out the door as opposed to the training piece. The current request for proposals is for a funding program administrator, not individual capacity projects. That time will come. And the current request for proposals is for a pilot block grant. And then finally, reporting well really matters, and we really hope that our partners can help us tell the story and help us manage the entire initiative in an adaptive way. So wrapping up for next steps, again, the request for proposals questions are due July 12th. We will post a recording of today's webinar on the YouTube channel. Please review the summary document if you haven't already. Today's presentation was an attempt to walk through a lot of that, so hopefully that was helpful. I know it's hard to digest a multiple page document, so hopefully this is another avenue for folks. And then the last piece to emphasize for anyone, if you're not already on our grants notification listserv, to please join it. In particular, once the funding program administrator is selected and they put out a call for proposals for individual capacity projects, we will help elevate that announcement on this listserv. So it's a great thing for anyone who's a potential subgrantee to join so they can keep their ear to the ground, nose to the ground. I think snakes have jaws to the ground. To know what's coming. So thank you so much for your time. This is a lot shorter than I expected, which is hopefully good. I can give you back a good portion of your afternoon. Are there any other questions or comments or concerns before we wrap up? Yeah, Christian.
Hi, Gianna, thank you. I had a question about the breakdown of state and federal funds, and I think there's a table that has the total for all the fiscal years, the breakdown, but for the initial 400K, is there a breakdown between the state and federal funds?
Yeah, for the initial 400K, it is mostly state, 300K state, 100K federal. We are applying for more federal funds. What eventually gets into the agreement for an amendment, it might be flipped. It might be more federal coming later. It might be equal amount federal and state. It kind of depends on how much more might be added to an agreement. Does that answer?
Yep,
Okay.
that is helpful. And then also another follow-up, in the performance metrics for having at least 15 entities that we engage in the Champlain Basin, is that an intended milestone for the first 400,000 or for the total lifespan of the grant with the money that is anticipated to be added?
To be determined, Christian, great question, but initially it is assigned for the amount of money that's given. And so it may go up, it may stay the same if more money is added. Yeah.
Okay.
So whatever performance measures are written into a grant agreement off the bat are the ones that are expected for that pot of funds. It may change with new money. Lynn.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's obviously been really well thought through, and it's really exciting to see this moving forward. A follow-up question on Christians, and then I have one other question as well. Just thinking about the prioritization that was set out, one of them is that the groups are not eligible for, that it's a priority to groups that are not eligible for LCBP capacity funding. Obviously, there's that $100,000 15 groups that's required to be in the Lake Champlain Basin. And just thinking through that, making sure that then you don't end up inadvertently, like maybe that, I don't know if that prioritization is meant to be for the remaining funding, because otherwise it's possible you may inadvertently exclude the groups that most need it, given that LCBP has narrowed their list of eligible entities to the groups with the lowest capacity, highest need. So I just wanted to see if that was the intention of the priority for groups that aren't receiving the LCBP funding, if that was meant for groups that are outside of the Champlain Basin for the state funding.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. There's definitely a complexity with working with both the federal funding that is geographically specific to the Lake Champlain Basin and the statewide money that is state funds. That prioritization list doesn't provide much guidance about weighting or like how to apply it to different funding sources, and can recognize there might be some contradictory information. It is sort of a suite of program goals that can be interpreted as prioritization if and when needed. So the program goals are to make this funding accessible where it may not otherwise be accessible. That probably mostly applies to the state funding, since the basin program funding has to be spent in the basin. But I think there's a sentence in there too that the technical project manager can consult with the selected funding program administrator at times when these might seem contradictory, to kind of refine the prioritization as needed before doing a selection.
That makes sense, and I understand the spirit of it, that you want to make sure that there's funding available to those who don't have it in other ways. Right. So that makes sense. And then one other question was wondering. I know that one of the challenges identified, I think, in the initial report, and certainly that we've talked about and I've heard a lot about, is the challenge of the cost reimbursable funding model. And that's particularly true for smaller organizations with the fewest existing resources, and organizations that are actually looking to add staff capacity. Having cost reimbursable versus upfront funding can present some real capacity challenges. So I'm wondering if I saw that in the grant RFP, it's similarly a cost reimbursable structure, and I wonder if DEC is in your internal processy discussion if there is consideration of changing to allow for upfront grants rather than cost reimbursable model.
Thanks, Lynn. We did have some conversations with that around the idea of advanced payments, and that was not is not currently an option for this pilot program, but what we did settle on with the business office was an opportunity to do a hybrid payment for the block grant. So you might notice a sentence that says this is cost reimbursable with the exception of an upfront payment upon grant execution. So that is a hybrid of a deliverables / cost reimbursable structure. So the funding program administrator will be able to bill for the deliverable of an executed grant agreement with us up to a certain percentage, I think maybe 10%. After that, they can sit on that money, they cannot, but as they get invoices from subgrantees, they can then bill us on a cost reimbursable basis. So I'm sure there are questions that might come up through the mechanics of doing that hybrid option. It hopefully gives a little bit of cushion and flexibility for the funding program administrator at times when cash flow is needed, that they could use that. But that was the intent of that sentence.
Thank you for clarifying.
Any other questions? Well, thank you so much for joining today. Please share with your partners and stakeholders as you see fit. We would love to get the word out there that this is going to be available for subgrantees, and also that obviously the request for proposal is available for potential funding program administrators. This is new. I'm excited, but I think there's a lot that all of us can learn about what it means to invest in capacity. So really thank you for your patience for us getting this out the door, and look forward to hearing from you all as this progresses. With that, have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.